Hi everyone, welcome to the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series on the webinar Living United for Racial Equity and Social Justice. My name is Minnie Chen from Mentor National Mentoring Partnership, and I'll be helping open up today's webinar before introducing our wonderful facilitator and our great speakers we have today. Before we get started, I want to share some housekeeping information. There's a link to live captioning in the chat box, so please utilize that if you want to access captioning for today's webinar. In 1 week, you'll receive an email about how to download a copy of these slides and view the webinar recording. You can also access this information directly by going to Mentor's website in the next week. And to continually improve this series, we're looking for your input. So a short survey will come up after this webinar ends. So please take 2 to 3 minutes to give us your feedback. We want this to be a participatory experience, so please use the question box to ask any questions throughout the webinar. I'll be queuing up any questions to share with our panelists during the Q&A section of the webinar. You may not get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to kind of open up the floor to hear what you all have to say. So to get a sense of who is with us today, I have 2 short polls. So the first poll is, what is your experience level in the mentoring field? Okay, so it looks like the majority of folks with 66% are experienced. We have 28% beginner and 6% experts. So our second poll here is, what is your role in the mentoring field? So are you a mentoring practitioner? Do you work in a mentoring program? A researcher, technical assistance provider, funder, other? I know sometimes we have some mentors on the call. And if you are other, feel free to type in the questions box, kind of what is your role in the mentoring field? And we welcome you all to our webinar today. Okay, it looks like the majority of folks are practitioners, 61%, with 33% other. So we'd love to hear kind of what your roles are. So I know we have some CASAs on, so welcome. Feel free to type in the chat if what your role is kind of in your organization or in your mentoring program as well. And we hope that today's information is applicable to everyone on the call. Okay, so now I'm going to go into introductions. So our facilitator of today's webinar is Atreus Good, who is the president and CEO of Mentor North Carolina, a statewide affiliate of Mentor National. In this role, Atreus leads a team that is working to increase the number of youth in quality mentoring relationships across North Carolina while working to address the systemic barriers that young people face on a daily basis. This includes cross-sector strategic engagement to elevate mentoring programs across the state, tracking external impact measurements, and providing the link between Mentor's national efforts, including public awareness and advocacy through national campaigns. Now I'm going to introduce our speakers we have today. So Nick Allen is the Chief Program Officer for the United Way of the Greater Triangle, a role that includes managing the strategies and execution of philanthropic storytelling, transformative community engagement, and multi-million-dollar impact investments across the 4-county region. So Nick resides in Durham, North Carolina, along with his wife and their 2 children. Then we have Gary Graham from the United Way of Palm Beach County. Gary is the Senior Mentoring Initiative Director at United Way of Palm Beach County, which oversees the Mentor Center of Palm Beach County, which is the local Florida mentor affiliate. So thank you, Nick and Gary, for joining us today. We did have another panelist, Shanae Motley from Georgia, who is going to join us, but she was unable to make the call today. So thank you, Atreus, Nick, and Gary for being on the call. So now I'm going to turn it over to Atreus to kind of open up the webinar and welcome our panelists.
Greetings and peace, family. As mentioned, my name is Atreus Good. I'm president and CEO of Mentor North Carolina, a local affiliate of Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. and we are glad you're joining us today for Living United for Racial Justice. As you all know, for more than 125 years, United Way has worked to identify key community issues and spark change through the power of partnerships. And in this moment in our history, as COVID-19 and structural racism lays waste to communities across the country, we want to explore the role that the United Way and mentoring programs can play in the fight for racial equity and social justice to provide the support necessary for all people to thrive, in particular young folks. And so we're very thankful to have folks from various United Way affiliates across the country exploring how mentoring programs and youth serving organizations can remain relevant and responsive during these challenging times. There will be an opportunity for folks later on to ask questions, and so definitely want you all to be able to do that. But one of the key goals that I have today is for folks to walk away with inspiration regarding their next steps in their racial equity journey, as we recognize that this is something that everybody needs to engage in to move us forward so we can all live the best lives possible. And so I'll actually pass it over to our panelists to do some introductions. So specifically, if you could talk about just your journey in this work and currently the work you're engaging in when it comes to racial equity. So whoever would like to start.
I guess I will go. Yeah, sorry about that. So one of the things that we are really trying to focus on in terms of equity, inclusion, and everything else is not only who we fund, but how we fund and who we actually have reviewing our applications. One of the things that we've noticed is we took a look at our funding cycles for the past 6 years before this previous fiscal year, and we looked at who we were funding and who was leading those organizations we were funding. And we found out that the majority of our agencies, overwhelmingly 90%, were led by people not of color, so white, either white females or white males. And that definitely was a problem. It's funny because we just talked, and Nick and I met at a conference in Chicago. And one of the things that was mentioned in that conference that really turned the light bulb on for me is this gentleman said the people closest to the pain are closest to the solution. And I thought, man, you know, a lot of the people who are funding these agencies are not close to the solution because they're nowhere near the pain. So we had to make sure that the agencies that we're going to fund were not only going to be close to the pain, but they knew that we had the solutions, that they had the solutions. So one of the first things we did is we wanted to make sure that the people who were reviewing these applications, the RFPs, were familiar with all programs, not just the ones that they were on boards of. So we had to get some new volunteers in to review these applications. The more that you're familiar with these other community programs and the grassroots and the faith-based programs, the more likely you'll be to fund those. And that's exactly what happened. We got new volunteers on board. We got more reviewers on board. And strangely enough, now we have over 35% of our programs are led by minority and people of color. So we had to change the way that we approach not only just the way the application was phrased, but who was reviewing those applications. Another thing that we also did and implemented for this year is we wanted to make sure that everybody, not just the people of color, that every single program that we had at United Way of Palm Beach County was going through the Racial Equity Institute. So that is a stipulation of funding for United Way of Palm Beach County. You will not receive funding under mentoring unless you have attended the Racial Equity Institute training, that 2-day training, strange enough for the people from North Carolina that come down and host it. So we wanted to make sure that everybody understand the role that racism and systemic racism plays in the United States and how people look at it through an equity lens, which is how we now fund everything, is through that equity lens.
Appreciate that, Gary. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Allen. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the United Way of the Greater Triangle, where our mission is to eradicate poverty and increase social mobility through the power of partnerships. It's pretty clear to us that we cannot be an anti-poverty organization without being an anti-racist organization. And so, you know, what we've done over the past 3-4 years is really establish the order of operations. What's it going to take for us to live into that promise of being an anti-racist organization to our community? And so when it comes to our strategic investment plan, we focus on 2 traditional sectors: healthy families So think about the affordable housing spectrum, think about healthy food and access to nutritious food, and think about mental health, specifically mental health attached to impoverished environments. And then you think about our cradle to career strategy, which is everything from first trimester to and through college and/or career for young people and their families. And those are traditional to United Ways across the world, across the country as well. Our third strategic pillar is really what I like to focus on, and that's what we call equity and leadership, where we look to empower local communities and local leaders to be a bigger part of the decision-making process, specifically for solutions that are being applied in their communities. Amplify the stories and the voices of marginalized leaders in communities across our 4-county footprint. And then we also want to make sure that we prepare the broader environment for the success of marginalized communities. Right? It's one thing to focus on and invest in leaders of color, communities of color, but if we're not doing the work to ensure that the environment that they have to operate, live, and work in is not supportive of their ideas, of their success, of their full participation, we are not completely living into our promise to our community. So strategically, we identified those 3 pillars and continue to make investments in ways that drive outcomes, significant outcomes for people in the triangle. Now, an additional layer is that it's one thing to ask our partners to be more equitable. But before we do that, we have to take a look in the mirror and truly understand operationally where our opportunities to grow are. And we've done an incredible amount of internal work as well to change the way that we operate as a funder. And that goes from everywhere from our admin and finance folks to our fundraising and storytelling and marketing to our volunteer and community engagement. And that internal work, I cannot emphasize enough, is critical not only to being effective in making sure that we are applying the anti-racist approach in the best way possible, but also to build trust in communities, to show and be transparent that we're on our journey as well. And I'm happy to talk with you all today about where we are in that process.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. And there's something that you said during the conversation that I want to lift up. So you mentioned this notion of holding up the mirror, and so being able to look and take an honest glance at what you see. And of course, similar to Mentor, we're a national organization. United Way, of course, is worldwide. And so I guess I'm curious as to what responsibility do you all believe that United Way Worldwide has in directly combating systemic racism?
I'll go first. I think everyone in this country is going through a race analysis in their personal place in what is the most significant movement of my lifetime. And I think United Way Worldwide, I've been a part of even before kind of the social unrest of this year, has been preparing and supporting local United Ways and helping them think through their equity journey. I think nationally, the trick is how do you create a structure where everybody, every community, no matter if they're on step number 1 or step number 100 of their equity journey, feels like they had the support and the roadmap to take the next significant step. And I think United Way Worldwide is doing their part in providing that structure they're on a journey like everybody else is. And I think there's opportunities for local United Ways to influence up. And I think there's also significant opportunities for United Way Worldwide to continue to influence the way that the local communities can figure out how to structurally and operationalize their equity journey.
Yeah, that's a great point. More so, I see United Way Worldwide as being a very large player, and more so, I think it's to really emphasize and more focus on not just how we see the manifestation of systemic racism, but now to put funds and put thought and put effort into really dismantling systematic racism. So no longer just funding what happens to kids who go through this process, but now funding how do we start to unravel what gets kids into this process. So I think that is the main thing of how we have to try to change our way of looking. Just locally, we've now started to invest in groundwater analysis of not only what happens nationwide, but in Palm Beach County. Why are we in the situation that we're in, and how can we invest to fight that change, and not just the manifestation of those systemic racism. So that is I think how United Way Worldwide can help is, you have a large machine who could fight on both ends,
And one thing you mentioned is the groundwater approach. And so for folks that are on the call, there was a question about resources. Racial Equity Institute that's based in North Carolina, they have several different formats for their trainings, but they do have one that's a half day called Groundwater. And so essentially it looks at the roots of systemic racism and how it intersects with all of our major institutions and systems. So that's a resource you all may be able to consider. So I'm curious as to how you engage a donor base that may not be willing to engage in racial justice work, because United Ways are unique in such that they're a funder, but they also fundraise. Gary, I'd say yours is specifically unique because you lead a mentor affiliate there, and so I'm curious if you consider your donor base, you consider historically what that's looked like for United Way. How does that conversation go with folks that may not understand why this racial equity work is important?
Believe it or not, for mentoring, we're funded and we have three major funders, one of them being Children's Service Council of Palm Beach County. And believe it or not, that conversation was fairly easy because they were actually more progressive and more ready to have that conversation than we were. They actually caught United Way of Palm Beach County a little flat-footed because they were so far ahead of it. And they put the stake in the ground and said, you know what, racism on any front is not tolerated. And their funding is the one who they put their money behind their funding. So they invested not only in the Racial Equity Institutes for all of their funded agencies, they invested in the groundwater analysis for all of their agencies. They wanted to know your DEI game plan for every single agency. So that conversation was very easy to have. And for our CEO, in terms of the smaller individual donors, she actually made a very bold statement in saying, this is where we stand as a whole, and either you're behind it or you're not. And what it actually forces people to do is to really show your hand. If you're going to say, I don't want to invest in something because, I don't like the way that you're framing racism, imagine how that puts you and your entire family foundation then, that you're now looked upon as the person who really does not want to stand behind fighting racism. It should be a very easy decision to make. And unfortunately right now, people are making a difficult decision, but I think for us, it was very easy because our lion's share funder was out in front and they were cheering us on all the way as we were making these moves with our funded agencies. So it was very easy for us.
Yeah, I want to, point out two layers of funders that have played a significant role for the work that we do here in the Triangle. First, the corporate community, local companies and corporations who are able to give larger dollar amounts have really rallied behind our fundraising efforts this year, whether it be rapid response to COVID, whether it be the anti-racism community fund that we launched in September, or even our campaign work that we're in right now. You know, I think it's important to note the structure of our organization in that marketing and storytelling sits underneath our community impact umbrella. And, you know, we've been talking about funding, but, you know, I think it's also important to have a parallel track of a narrative shift. How are we communicating? How are we changing the mental models of the general community? What stories are we telling that really start to shift and present communities that we've talked about in this work for so long in a different way, in a different light, that empowers them, that shows strength, and that is more justice oriented and less of a charity model. And so when we tell those stories to our corporate partners, they've responded tremendously. And we were able to raise $1.4 million for Rapid Response Fund. We were able to raise, you know, over $500,000 for our anti-racism community fund. And you know, a big chunk of that was from larger corporate donors. Now, when it comes to the 12,000 individual donors that contribute to United Way, more traditionally through paycheck deduction, you know, those donors vote with their dollars, right? It's less of a PR play for them, and so the proof is going to be in the pudding. But the stories that we tell are absolutely told through an equity lens, told through a racial and gender equity lens, in a way that meets people where they are, right? We don't hit them with the super academic racial analysis if they're not ready for that, right? So part of it is the nuance of relationship building, understanding your audience, and being prepared to have that conversation no matter what step of the journey that they're on. But also realizing that there is no compromise in this racial equity work, right? There is no halfway going in. There is no dipping your toe into that conversation. And so, you know, a lot of the work, the internal work of preparing our folks to be able to do their, you know, their duties through a racial equity lens, but also being savvy enough to understand the audience and shift the story in a way that's impactful and keeps people engaged so that we can move them along that spectrum for the long haul.
Thank you for that. So I know that United Way and United Ways, you know, across this country in particular, definitely connect with mentoring programs, with out-of-school time programs. There's several examples. I know the United Way of Allegheny County had a partnership with Pittsburgh Public Schools on the Be a School Mentor program. They partnered with the mentoring partnership in Southwest Pennsylvania that we have. Of course, Gary and his work of mentor down there is housed within the United Way. And so I guess I'm curious to both of you all to ask the question, to what degree do you believe it's important for the mentoring community at large to have a common understanding of racial equity and community conditions when engaging in this work? Because I think that sometimes traditionally mentoring is focused on behavior change and looking at particularly what the mentee may do differently. If we also consider who's being mentored, those are overwhelmingly Black and brown youth. And so I'm curious, how important is that, you know, when engaging in this work for the mentoring community to understand and have a clear understanding of racial equity?
You know, there's a few different things, not only within our internal United Way, but also some of the questions that we've now started to ask within our mentors. And one of the things we like to ask sometimes for some of our incoming mentors is, why are people in poverty? And it just kind of gives you a good idea as to somebody's mindset, and it gives you an opportunity to also have some discussion. And that question is like pivotal about why this is important for our mentors. A lot of our mentors, especially in Palm Beach County, come from extremely different backgrounds. If you don't know about Palm Beach County, all the way out east, we have the island of Palm Beach, excuse me, where you have, you know, the Kennedys and the Trumps. And then all the way out west, we have the largest agricultural landmass in terms of sugarcane this side of the Mississippi. Not many people know that about Palm Beach County. So you have extreme poverty out west around Lake Okeechobee. And people think that people are in poverty just because, you know, they're lazy and they choose not to work. And this is an opportunity to inform people about how you should be actually going about your mentoring, because you're looking at it from a deficit model instead of a strength model. They're not there because they don't want to work. They want to work, they want to achieve, and they want to get ahead. And we had to inform them about the policies that were put in place that kept people behind. So when you're dealing with mentors, specifically from a completely different background, you have to have that conversation about equity, because you don't want to put somebody in a position where a child could potentially be harmed by a mentor who thinks they're doing good and want to have this saviorism mentality. That's not what we want. Either you're doing it because you just want to share what you have and share your knowledge and your skills, or you're doing because you think that this poor child is in this bad situation and you can help them out of it. That's not what we want. We want you to share your path to where you are right now. We don't want you to you know, be burdened with this child who you think is just, you know, lazy or comes from this lazy background. So it's always important just to have mentors in a good position to understand their youth and what they're trying to accomplish with them, of just making sure that they progress in life and become whole individual good people, not that they're going to save them and get them out of their community. That's not what they want to do. They want to stay in the communities and help build the communities. They don't want to leave. So it's just changing mindsets and changing understanding. So that work is so important, specifically for mentors and mentees, and just having the right mindset. You know, we have all these outcomes that we have from National Mentoring Partnership because we are a local affiliate, about what happens when the match is closed prematurely, and what happens, you know, in the wrong type of program when you don't do these things based on the elements of effective practice. But also now we have these outcomes about what happens when a mentor is bad and when the mentor has the wrong mentality about the perception of a child. So we have that data. So we want to make sure that we never want to put a child in a position where they're going to be harmed by somebody who's trusted. So there it is. That's my long-winded answer. Sorry about that.
And I definitely agree with the approach that Gary outlined there. You know, the only thing that I would add is the opportunity when we talk about changing the system of philanthropy in the triangle. Our ultimate outcome is shifting the mental models of the general community. And a really effective way to do that is through engagement activities that gets people proximate to the work that we're investing in. Now, you could imagine without the proper training and without intentionally preparing those people, that general community, without Black and white, first of all, right? Without intentionally preparing them to engage in communities that they are not familiar with, could be detrimental to the young person, right? So we can't focus so much on the engagement activity to change mental models and drive donations and monetary donations, but how do we safely expose people to parts of their community that they never would have been exposed to before? And how do we keep the health and safety of the young people as a priority in that engagement? And I think that's the opportunity that mentoring has for us, that I would also add to Gary's comments, in shifting the way that the general community thinks about, approaches, and ultimately decides to invest their time, their talents, and their treasures in the work that we're doing.
So I guess connected to that, and this is a question that we have in the chat box, and I think Gary, you spoke a little bit about it, and I think Nick, you were on the edge of it. I guess I'm curious as to what does that preparation process look like for volunteers, for mentors, in particular those that hold privilege that may be entering into under-resourced communities to help them do no harm, and specifically. How much teaching do you think is reasonable? You know, as we consider just the social and political environment we've been in regard to fact decay and the truth of where we find ourselves not always being honored. Some of that comes into interplay with folks that might be engaging with young folks, and so that preparation process. Curious about that, and how much of preparation do you think is necessary before folks can engage in communities?
Well, all of our programs, obviously, you do the pre-screening, the official screening, which is the level 2. But along every path, you have the screening that goes along in terms of what mentors are saying during their personal interview, what they're saying during trainings, and what they're saying during their orientation. So the traditional mentoring program, recruitment, screening, training, and orientation, that's the path to being a mentor in a program. During that orientation, ideally what would happen is there's going to be probing questions about the children that you're going to be serving. Because in order for any mentor to be in a program, you have to understand the youth that you're serving in that program and what success looks like for match closure. What does success look like for that mentee? And along the lines, ideally, every mentor should understand that these children aren't, coming from a deficit model. These kids are in the program not because something is wrong with them, but because every young person could benefit from having a mentor. Just like every business person understands the purpose of having a mentor. Every successful person has somebody they always reach out to for information, for probing questions. So every child is just the same. So along the lines, ideally during that orientation phase, that is when those questions should be hashed about poverty, about what the children are in the program, who they are, and what you're trying to accomplish in that program. Now, if a mentor doesn't get it in that process, we have given every mentoring program the same thought and the same message about what they should do, and that's don't match them. At any given point, you're okay to say this mentor is not a fit for our program, and you don't have to give any reason, any excuse, or any justification. If you just have a gut feeling about a potential mentor, you don't have to grant them access to your mentoring program. So at any given point, you are protector of those children first and foremost as a mentoring agency. And if you see that a mentor is just not going to be a fit, by all means, you don't have to match them.
Surprisingly, I went to the gym one time and I'm not strong. Right. And so this idea that you can go to a racial equity training and then all of a sudden be a racial equity expert is one of the biggest fallacies of this movement. And so when we talk about how much is enough, it's infinite. You got to do that. You got to do that work every day, right? You gotta do that work every day, and the responsibility of the United Way to the Greater Triangle, I think, is to provide both the informal learning opportunities, the informal learning opportunities, and the continuous flooding of the stories in the media that people consume around this work with a foundation that's rooted in anti-racism. I also think that I harken back to the first time that I really had a significant racial equity training, and at the end of my my 2-day phase 1 training, I ran through my entire life and processed like interactions and engagements through this new awareness that I had, right? And then I also think about, you know, if I was educated or made aware of that information around race and its structure in this country at an earlier age, I would have felt empowered to call that out when it was happening in my environment and happening to me. Right? So it's not all, I think there's an opportunity to build the awareness and empower young people and the people surrounding them to identify and call out both the macro and micro versions of what we're talking about in a way that protects them and doesn't just put the onus on the training, right? We're in the people work, right? And so I think we have to prepare people to engage young people of color, and I think we need to prepare young people of color and empower them to call that out and protect themselves.
I like the gym analogy you use, you know, about strength training. You take time off and you're gonna lose that muscle, you know, so you really have to make sure you're consistent with it. So that was really a poignant point you made. I'm curious too. You know, a lot of folks talk about systems change, and I'm curious as we all think about mentoring. I know Nick, you're engaged in some national mentoring work with boys and young men of color, and Gary, of course, you're leading that work there. In West Palm Beach. What sort of institutional or policy reforms, if we were to implement those, you think would make impacts in disrupting structural racism and closing the opportunity gaps that mentoring programs are some of which are working to address with the young folks that they work with, especially those that are pushed to the margins? What sort of institutional policy reforms do you think would be helpful?
You want me to go first, Gary?
Man, by all means, my brain is spinning. So,
all right, you know, it is my experience here in the Triangle that a large majority of the mentoring agencies that are serving young people of color are led by people of color. It is also my experience that people of color are underrepresented and under-resourced within our United Way funding portfolio. A couple years ago, we made the explicit step of creating a fund exclusively for marginalized leaders within our funding portfolio, which are people of color and women. We called that program 10 to Watch. Minnie, this is a good time to drop that video in the chat. But, you know, I think what that was the tip of our pinky toe into systemically, structurally changing the access to resources for under-resourced and underrepresented organizations, including, you know, mentoring agencies. And Atreus is one of our inaugural 10 to Watchers in the first cohort. And what that opportunity did was it gave unrestricted funding to organizations led by women and or people of color to do their work, right? And mostly to change our portfolio in a way where we're not just counting the number of people, but we're counting the amount of dollars. We're counting the amount of resources and the influence. So as a funder, I think it was very important for us to keep an eye on both of those things at the same time. Now, as we move forward with our bigger bucket investment opportunities, every investment we want to make, we want to send through an equity lens. But I also think it's important for funders to carve out space to correct some of the historical trends and marginalizing of people of color in the nonprofit space.
Yeah, that is awesome. And there's a couple things that came up in that I was thinking as you were speaking. And through that Racial Equity Institute training, they always say you must be proximate to the problem and you have to mark it. Wherever you see it, mark it. So they, literally went down and we had to mark all of our funding. Who's getting our funding? How much? Who are they led by? How much funding is going to these communities? And not only how much funding is going into these communities, but who is actually serving those communities through that funding? Are they people, or is it people who are people of color? Is it not? So we're paying people from outside to come in and serve this community while there's an agency literally sitting in that community who's been doing good work that hasn't received a dime from us. Why is that? So we had to change our approach, man, and how we funded, but we also had to change our approach of us actually doing outreach. And it's not just outreach of reaching out to programs and seeing what they are. If you're going to really do outreach, you have to reach out and try to put them in a position where they can receive funding from us. Is our process too difficult? We're not talking about lowering the bar. We're talking about getting in a position to raise capacity, increase capacity to where they're going to meet that bar and exceed and do what they've always been doing in meeting the needs of the community. So we had to do some training, and we had to do several trainings about, logic model training and different things that really didn't have a context for, but they were doing, and they had great outcomes. So we had to change our approach in what outreach meant. We had to change our approach in marking every agency that was receiving funding from us, who those agencies were, where they were serving those kids, and who was serving those kids in those communities. So the number one policy is really marking it and also following the money. Not only just with the agencies we funded, but also even for events, our vendors. Why don't we have, if we're going into this community, we're going to have a community event, why shouldn't it be a vendor who's from that community, who's going to be cooking, who's going to be serving, who's going to be hosting? Like that doesn't make any sense. We should not be having Panera Bread going to Riviera Beach. That's not happening. So we change who we're funding, we're changing our vendors, we're changing our locations, everything. And we have to market. You have to market. The funny thing that still sticks with me is we always say, and they're always labeled these HBCUs, but you never hear PWI before any major school, like University of Florida, PWI. You never hear that, but market. So you could actually, it's on the front of your mind, which goes back to the previous question of how often you need to do this exercise all the time. Because if you don't market it and you don't get close to it, it'll go right over your head, and you'll never see it when it's staring you right in the face.
So I think what you all are talking about also relates to a question that's in the chat box here. And so Nick and Gary, I mean, you all have unique approaches at your United Ways to address this. And so I'm curious to what degree you all know of, or how widespread is the United Ways when it comes to funding support for mentoring programs who want to incorporate a racial equity lens. So specifically for mentors, for mentees in the community, what does that look like across the United Way landscape, so to speak?
Well, I'll speak just from us in here. We have a pot of money that is specifically mini grants up to $7,500 twice a year to implement something along those lines in terms of DEI. So we want to increase capacity for any mentoring agency who wants to look at things through an equity lens, whether sending all of your mentors to Racial Equity Institute, whether it be you develop training specifically around this area for your mentors. We have a fund specifically for this. And strange enough, we got it from our principal, our lion's share funder, because they thought it was important work, and we think it's important work. And anybody who's interfacing with our kids, and any agencies who's interfacing with our kids, we think it's important that you look at things through an equity lens as well. So we have funds behind it. We try not to just talk it, we try to walk it too. And the real fortunate thing, and I'll give him props, his name is Seth Bernstein. He's our senior VP, older white Jewish dude, and he takes all the bullets for me, which is great because I don't want to be angry black man all the time. So he's the one, you laugh, but it's true. He's the one who's actually really implementing these policies. I'll whisper in his ear, and he's like, yeah, this is a great idea. And he's the one that's proposing these changes. So it's not coming from Gary Graham or from Seth Bernstein. So yeah, we have it to make sure that we put some funds behind it to make sure agencies, even the smaller ones, can make that pivot and go down that path.
Yeah, you said a mouthful, but that with making sure that the narrative around racial equity and anti-racism is coming from multiple perspectives, mouths, faces, colors, and I can't, express how important that has been for us here locally, to have our CEO, Eric Gucan, really go, take the reins of his own personal journey, right? And be transparent and communicate, kind of the goals of our organization in a way, that speaks to, an audience that may not, hear the same message when the same words come out of my mouth. I think United Way Worldwide, recently released an equity, footprint, a structure to help local United Ways really think through, how to really start this work. I think what we saw in heat maps of this country as it relates to, our most recent presidential election, there are some places that are going to be, more willing to have those conversations than others, and I mean that as a community, right? Not as a United Way, but there are certain challenges and barriers, that some local United Ways, are going to have to, overcome to really take those significant next steps. And one thing that I would encourage and employ everybody on this call to do is find your local United Way and offer your support of that work. Right? I think there's a strength in community. I tell our nonprofit partners all the time, do not underestimate your influence on a funder. Right? Organize, respectfully communicate, right? But be clear and steadfast in, what you believe is going to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish in your community, and then do it together, right? I think we have to blur the lines between funder and fundee and grantor and grantee, and really do a power analysis, and challenge the power structures within philanthropy in a way, that really gets us over the hump. And I think there's a significant opportunity to do that if you're United Way, or even if they are, but if your United Way is not really, if you're not aware of the steps that they're taking, let them know that there's some support in the community and that they're not doing this alone. I think that'll be, a really important thing to do, to support your community's work.
Gary, you mentioned Seth, white man, Nick, of course, Eric is white man also, and so in which they navigate in certain ways. And both of you said, they may be able to say things that perhaps you all couldn't say when it comes to this work. And so I'm curious as to what specific challenges have you all encountered as Black leaders? What does that look like for you, and how have you navigated those challenges?
You go ahead, Nick. Let me get my words right so I don't get fired.
The first thing that comes to mind is that for me, I've been navigating that my whole life. I went to school. I'm from Baltimore City. I went to school. I went to a private school. I lived in a lower middle class neighborhood in East Baltimore. Went to a private school in the county. My class didn't look like my neighborhood. And I think, the challenges that I have been experiencing are the same ones that pop up from time to time now. And I got a lot of practice in the gym on those, right? And the idea that, people are surprised. The thing that shocks me the most, I think, is the idea that people have low expectations. And then they act surprised when, we're able to have the depth of the conversation, the creativity and the innovation of the solutions, and then I let them breathe a little bit to catch up. And then we're able to have some really significant conversations. But you know and also I think the idea of the Black man talking about race is a significant barrier. And I've definitely learned to feel like I'm not compromising myself, my values, in having conversations, but also not going in a way that alienates and makes it easy for people to disengage from critical conversations. And that's a skill that I'm continuously working on. But I think those are kind of the two barriers that pop up to me that are systemic in nature, right? Like it don't matter where I go, what county I'm in, what company I'm talking to. You can bet your bottom dollar one of those two things are going to happen when we start talking about racism in this country and in the triangle.
Yeah. So it's twofold. One is kind of checking myself a lot of times when I'm going to a presentation, knowing and feeling like I have to walk in the door and prove something, because automatically you feel like, you know, I'm speaking at it from a deficit model myself. It's like, wait a second, I'm not here to prove anything to anybody. I got here on my merit and my work. So that's one of the things that's kind of self-imposed. But then the other thing is you will have people who the difficult part is about this work, specifically down here, is the higher you go, there's less people that look like you. And this is just the office stuff. I have many personal conversations with this. When we are at social events, when we go to all these balls and galas and things like that, you know, it's just very few. So this work is important, but sometimes it's very isolating to minority leaders. It's very isolating, and you need to seek out other people like yourself to really keep your fire burning and keep pushing you along. Because inside of my office, you know, is three Black men and I employ two of them. So, you know, it's really not a ton that you can really talk to. So it's like, you kind of have to keep your ego checked and making sure that you don't try to come out too boastful, but then at the same time you have to seek others who are going to push you and make sure that you're in the right direction. You're in the right mindset to do this work. You will have people who doubt you. You will have people who underestimate you. And the one thing that I have to really refrain from and not jump on is when people call you articulate. To everybody listening out there, if you listen and get nothing else from this, do not call the Black man articulate. It is like the biggest trigger for me, because it's pretty much saying you're not expecting us to put sentences together coherently. So just as an FYI, just leave that word alone. Articulate is not a compliment at all. So that is just my thing. It's just my pet peeve. It could be me, but that's just my thing. You're going to be doubted. But at the same time, you're going to find support where you don't think it is. So you can't have a blanket under, thinking of everybody. You're going to find support where you don't think it's there, and some people who you thought would support you don't. So that's it. That's once again, my very long-winded answer.
Oh no, brother, I appreciate that. Yeah, just the word articulate in general triggers me, because it's one of those things where it's like, well, what did you expect? I think one of my horror stories is someone calling me clean, as in hygienically clean. Oh, you're so clean. It's like, oh, well, thanks. It's my soap. I washed today. I'm glad you noticed. So we'll keep rolling here. So want to tie in this notion of intersectionality. So how do you deal with multiple forms of oppression? And we have a question here in the chat box about the generational divide. So how do you bring racial equity training or just this training to mentors that may be older? And this is something that could be for not only white mentors, but also Black mentors. And so this notion that the older generation may have ways that they want young folks to navigate that young folks don't, it doesn't fit. And so how do you make sure that as you're bringing people into these conversations, they have the proper lens, be that the racial lens, the generational lens, the whatever those lenses might be. How do you infuse that when you're bringing folks in?
Man, Nick said it earlier. United Way is partly funding, and people give to United. You have to make it relatable to them. And the story that I tell to make it significant to older folks is one story about one person, but it's two different stories. It's about my grandfather, who was in World War II, and they had this thing called the GI Bill, as everybody knows. And people talking about government handouts and free handouts. So the GI Bill was for former military to come home, and they were to get loans, low interest loans, and go to college, reduced or free. So that's what the GI Bill was supposed to do. However, at that time, there were no colleges for Black GIs to go to, very limited. And some of the colleges down here were all female. So that's off the list. And now, because you are from a certain area, banks don't give you loans because redlining. So a bank will not give you a home loan. So while the white GIs came home and became chemists and surgeons and doctors, my grandfather came home and became a roofer. Literally at 82 years old, died climbing off a roof. So also that same story, these roofers who were employed, former servicemen, were fired and rehired every summer. So that way they are no longer eligible for retirement. So for 35 years, you were fired and rehired. So while you may have worked with the same company for 35 years, you have no retirement. And how do you build wealth? Through homes and through savings, life insurance. We don't get that. And that's not like, some ancient history. That is my grandfather. So those are practices that were put in place that people now understand, like, oh man, I didn't know that happened. So the older folks are like surprised, like, man, I didn't know that stuff like that would happen. Well, yeah, of course you wouldn't know, because the GI Bill benefited you. It didn't benefit us. So you have to put it into a context where people can understand it, and make it real for them. So that is the one thing that I know that I live with, is to be able to tell that story and just, have that whenever and make it real for people. Storytelling.
Yeah, I think what Gary just referenced is that this work is incredibly personal. And I am a huge proponent of caucusing, which means the segmentation of specific demographic groups in a way that you can relate, train, raise awareness by accessing their personal experiences. A 60-year-old Black man and a 60-year-old white man, it is likely that they have had very different life experiences, right? So if we're trying to introduce a new racial equity analysis to these folks, I think we have to draw on those personal experiences in a way that makes it personal, makes it relatable, and then you start to move kind of the ball down the field very, very incrementally. But you're starting from two different, you may not even be on the same field if you have to have kind of this big room of all these different lived experiences, right? So, I think one strategy that may work is being very intentional and explicit about training, caucusing, why you're caucusing, and then leveraging those assets in a way to relate the story and what you're trying to convey to that particular audience.
Let me ask you this. I'm curious as we think about the landscape we find ourselves in within COVID-19 and social distancing and things of that nature. What are some strategic ways you all think we can employ racial equity approaches during these times? So specifically, if someone wanted to support, say, their neighbors or their family What do you all think that looks like right now?
You know, it's tough. The one thing that we have here, and I obviously I use Palm Beach County as my reference because this is where I work, play, and live. Is the technology. There's a huge gap in technology for folks right now that people weren't even considering. So the school board down here was giving all these youth free computers, you know, to make sure that they were able to have this distance learning and things like that. What we did not consider was all the youth who were in alternative or charter schools. So how do they pay for their computers, and where do they get their computers from, and how do they learn safely from a distance? So we did not look at that at all. So we had to find ways to get funds to those people, and some of the larger systems would actually not pay for it. Like these billion-dollar systems here in Palm Beach County, not saying any names, didn't want to come out of pocket for it. The total cost would have been $242,000. And they are raking in billions from taxpayer funds, and they chose not to take that path. So we had to find ways to raise funds to support those youth who were not supported by the school district. So that is the biggest way to support people, is through technology, making sure that they're able to be distant, to socially learn from a distance, and just making sure they're supported. Because right now, if they don't have the outside, at least make them feel comfortable inside. So that's one of the ways we make sure that they can feel supported is through addressing their technology needs.
Yeah, there are two things that come to mind. I think one, through our Rapid Response Fund, it became pretty clear very early on that certain communities were suffering disproportionately the impacts, the financial and health impacts of COVID. And from the very beginning, we were very explicit around, if you donate to us to support COVID rapid response, this is what we're prioritizing in our decision making, and this is why. Right? And you vote with your dollar. And thankfully, many people voted with their dollars here in the triangle. And I think generally, more broadly, to your question, Trey, it's like, how can we support our neighbors, our family, our friends in the COVID environment on this racial equity journey? From the beginning, I think it's really important to encourage people to go out and learn. Put the onus of learning on yourself, right? Like, don't wait for the training to come. Don't wait for something to pop in your inbox where, oh, I can sign up for that. There's plenty of information out there where you can learn and explore and go on a journey and start to really understand the historical facts that had contributed to the conditions that we're in now. There's plenty of information out there that is factual, that is a great analysis of our current conditions and how race and gender and other determining factors play a role in poor outcomes for some and not others. And so, I think really taking a hold of the idea that this is a personal journey, taking the onus of learning on yourself, going out and finding trusted resources, and just diving in, getting comfortable with the terminology, right? Like, it's amazing what happens when people have the right words to express how they're feeling, right? And I think a big part of this racial equity work is just getting people comfortable with saying white, black, white supremacy, like these trigger words that have been triggers in this country for 400 and some odd years. I think we have to get past the discomfort of saying it to really have critical conversations, and that's really done on a personal level. And I think there's plenty of opportunity for people to do that, especially in this COVID environment.
So we have time for one more question, and Nick, I think you provided a really great segue into it. So you talked about putting the onus on yourself, that this is a journey, and so I'm curious as to how the two of you are articulating and holding yourselves accountable to a long-term vision for racial justice. Because as we know, we've been in this game for a while. And so what does that process look like for the two of you?
It's wild for me. I recognize how unique this window of time is in our country. And my gut is telling me, oh, you got to rush and hurry up and do everything you ever dreamt of in terms of racial equity and philanthropy, and do it right now because the window might close, right? And that's a trap. That's a booby trap that we set for ourselves, and thinking that we need to rush and hurry up and do something just because we can. I think the opportunity here is to permanently prop up the window, right? Not try to do something and sneak in while the window's closing, but what are you putting in there to prop up that window so that the window is there? You can go through that window forever, right? How do we permanently prop up that window? So I think that's structural approaches, not topical approaches to racial equity in our work, but structural approaches. There are permanent things in our organization that will be changed forever because of the work that we're doing now. And so I think fighting that urge of urgency, keeping the eye on the permanent changes, the procedural, the policy structural changes, and recognizing that this window, if done right, as a community, we can keep it open. We don't have to worry about it closing.
Yeah, the how I hold myself accountable is I want to make sure that not only that we're closing the gap for mentoring. Obviously, we want to make sure that we clear up the wait list for youth waiting to be matched with a mentor in Palm Beach County, but also being able to literally have the pen and mark it wherever we see it. So that is the one thing I take away with from the Racial Equity Institute is to market. So in terms of internal policies for United Way of Palm Beach County and how we fund and who we fund, from top to bottom, I'm going to mark it. So all the reviewers who are reviewing these multi-million-dollar RFPs, how many reviewers are Black? How many are Latino? How many are women? How many are men? Where are they from? And making sure that we get the best process. If we have 30 white reviewers and they are all on boards of white agencies, who's going to get funded? So it's pretty simple that we change the process and we look at it from top to bottom of who we fund, how we're funding, and who's reviewing, because that's the way you make real change. Not lowering the bar for our agencies, not making sure that we bring in somebody and have to build them up all along the way. No, they come in qualified and they're able to do the work and show it. So that's one of the things I hold myself accountable with, is making sure that we bring in programs who are ready to compete with these larger agencies and do the work and show that their outcomes right against the bigger agencies are as good, if not better. So,
my brothers, thank you for such a lively conversation. Very grateful for your time and your expertise and your wisdom. And at this point, I will pass it back over to Minnie Chin, who will take us to the next steps.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Atreus, Nick, and Gary, so much for being here today. And I just wanted to share everyone's contact information. So feel free, if anyone has any additional questions, to reach out to our panelists there. But really grateful for everybody's time today. And I just want to move on as we close out the webinar, just some additional resources we have here at Mentor. Mentor does have a page on our website just around resources for mentors around race, inclusion, and cultural respect. So feel free to check that out. And there will be more webinars posted there as well. Our affiliates here, Atreus and Gary from North Carolina and Florida, are part of our affiliate network, and they serve as a clearinghouse for training, resources, public awareness, and advocacy. So we encourage you to find your local affiliate in your state, if there is one, and definitely reach out to learn more about the work that they are all doing. The Mentoring Connector is also a resource that you can find mentors by submitting your program. It's also free for you to do so. And lastly, please check out the National Mentoring Resource Center, and there's lots of different resources there, as well as the availability to apply for free training and technical assistance. So that's also another resource that programs can utilize if they are looking to improve or refine their policies, any training materials as well. Lastly, I also wanted to share out this resource that Mentor, in partnership with Partners for Youth with Disabilities, is offering, this training disability mentoring certification. So it's a free training series on how to run inclusive and accessible mentoring programs. I think it's especially important during when thinking about diversity and inclusion work. How are we making sure that our programs are inclusive for all of our youth? So this is another resource for you all. If anybody is interested to apply, feel free to click on that link right there. Lastly, please help us out by answering the survey at the end of this webinar. Again, you will all get an email with information on how to download the slides, access the recording, and any additional resources on the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series webpage. We hope you'll all stay connected with us. If you have any additional feedback, please email us, visit our webpage for past as well as upcoming webinars. And again, that's the link to the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series on our website, so definitely check out that for our next webinar. So thank you again for everyone joining us today, and we hope you take care.